Colombia in the 1980s was a country of staggering contradictions, stunning landscapes shadowed by relentless violence. It was a place where the magic of Gabriel Garcia Marquez met the cold echo of gunfire. Faith and fear walked side by side. The decade tested the nation's soul through economic collapse, political stagnation, civil war, and the rise of a new force, the narco-traffickers. For decades, Colombian politics was ruled by a narrow elite. Power shifted between the same wealthy families under the banners of the liberal and conservative parties. Corruption wasn't the exception, it was the system. In cities like Bogotá, Medellin, and Cali, the state had a face. But in the remote countryside and the hillside slums, the government was just a distant idea. Into this vacuum came conflict. Leftist guerrilla groups FARC, ELN, and M19, fueled by inequality and Marxist ideology, launched an insurgency. Their tactics: kidnappings, extortion, attacks on civilians. In response, right-wing paramilitaries, funded by landowners, businesses, and increasingly drug lords, struck back with brutal force. The result: a war with no clear sides, no safe ground, and no end in sight. And then out of Medellin's poorest neighborhoods came a man who would redefine everything: Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Born into poverty, he quickly rose from street hustler to smuggler, and then to the king of cocaine. By the early 80s, Escobar was no longer just a criminal, he was running a global empire. The Medellin cartel controlled the cocaine trade from coca fields to US streets. At its peak, the cartel supplied over 80% of America's cocaine, earning millions every day. That money bought power. Judges, police, politicians, everyone had a price. Those who didn't take his silver took his lead. But Escobar wanted more than power. He wanted legitimacy. He dreamed of becoming a national hero, even president. To many in Medellin, he already was. He built homes, soccer fields, schools, using drug money to win hearts. To the poor, forgotten by the government, he was a savior. In 1982, Escobar entered politics. He won a seat in Congress. For a moment, it looked like he might actually succeed. But Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla exposed Escobar's criminal past, forcing him out. Months later, Lara was assassinated. It marked the beginning of a full-scale war between Escobar and the state. What followed was terror. Car bombs shook the cities. Judges were murdered. Police officers gunned down. Escobar declared war on Colombia itself. The 1989-1990 presidential election was drenched in fear. Leading candidate Luis Carlos Galán, a reformer who stood firmly against the cartels, was assassinated at a campaign rally. The country was stunned. Two more candidates followed: Bernardo Jaramillo and Carlos Pizarro, gunned down in cold blood. Even an entire passenger plane was blown out of the sky in a failed attempt to kill Galán's successor. And here is where our alternate history begins. In this version of events, the assassination of Galán doesn't ignite resistance. It breaks the nation's spirit. The violence is too much. The people lose faith. The government looks helpless. The old political elite offers no answers. Then silence, the bombs stop, the killings pause. Behind the scenes, Escobar makes his move. Through loyal media, whispered deals, and carefully crafted speeches, he makes his pitch. Peace for a price. He'll end the violence, crush the other cartels, force a ceasefire, rebuild the nation, but he wants the presidency. He doesn't hide, he runs openly, and his campaign strikes a chord. They promise change, I bring peace. To oppose him risks war. To accept him means surrendering to a narco-state. The international community is horrified but paralyzed. Escobar promises to regulate cocaine, not stop it. Many doubt him, but few are willing to test him. And to a nation exhausted by bloodshed, his promise is seductive. Order, stability, an end to chaos. The lines between villain and leader blur. This is the moment Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, steps into the spotlight, not as a shadowy criminal, but as a presidential candidate. The 1990 presidential race in this alternate Colombia wasn't a campaign. It was a fever dream aired on primetime television. This wasn't politics as usual. It was a clash between chaos and control, a battle for the nation's soul fought in the shadow of bullets and the blinding glow of narco billions. Pablo Escobar didn't just enter the race, he hijacked it. What had once been a flawed democracy became a national referendum: surrender or sovereignty, fear or force. He didn't run under the banner of any party he hadn't already corrupted. Instead, he launched his own. The Movement for National Restoration, a name that told the people, Colombia is broken and I'm the only one who can fix it. His slogan said it all. Paz, plata y plomo, peace, silver and lead. It was a promise and a threat. País through. Dominance, prosperity funded by blood money, death for those who stood in the way. His supporters formed an unlikely alliance, the poor, the scared, the desperate. In Medellin's slums, he wasn't a candidate, he was a savior. They lived in the homes he built, played on the fields he funded. Their loyalty wasn't political, it was personal, fierce, unshakable. When Escobar arrived, he didn't campaign. He descended. Not a politician, a king among the forgotten. He didn't shake hands, he gave blessings. He didn't make promises, he delivered fate. The elites in Bogotá never saw you, he would shout to crowds. They looked down and saw dirt. I see the beating heart of Colombia. They stole your votes, I'll build your future. Beyond the cities, rural Colombia listened too. Tired of living between guerrillas, paramilitaries, and a silent state, people craved one thing: order. Escobar gave them exactly that, with brutal efficiency. He offered local warlords a simple deal. Join the movement or disappear. Many chose survival. Entire armed groups morphed into political foot soldiers. And just like that, the violence stopped. In a land soaked with fear, even peace paid tribute to him. Escobar's campaign was everywhere. He didn't buy ads, he bought media. Entire radio stations, newspapers. Airwaves filled with heroic tales, slick documentaries, and staged interviews with ordinary Colombians singing his praises. Even a hit song, "The Man Who Will Save Us," echoed from every market, bus, and bar. With his wealth, he built a nationwide machine overnight. Food, medicine, cash, all branded with his movement's logo. He promised highways to unite the forgotten and homes to replace the slums. And the people believed him, because unlike politicians, Escobar had the power to make it real. The elites were stunned, some were terrified, others calculating. In Bogotá's private clubs and boardrooms, a new logic emerged. I don't like it, a fictional industrialist might say. But what has democracy given us? Bombs, kidnappings, strikes. Escobar guarantees order. He'll crush the unions, end the war. Yes, there's a cost, but it's one we might just have to pay. To some, he was a monster. To others, a necessary one. In Washington, panic. The U.S. watched helplessly as the DEA's most wanted man closed in on power. Publicly, there were threats of sanctions. Privately, CIA operatives scrambled, whispering of coups, funding rivals, assessing generals. But Colombia's army was fractured. Some officers sympathized with Escobar's promise of total victory. Others clung to the Constitution, but feared that stopping him would ignite civil war. As election day neared, the country held its breath. There were no celebrations, only tension. Streets fell silent, watched over by a mix of police and Escobar's gunmen. The vote was no longer a choice, it was a surrender. Millions stayed home in fear. Millions more, the loyal, the poor, the desperate, showed up. And when the results came, no one was surprised. Pablo Escobar, narco, warlord, kingmaker, had won. Not the hearts of a nation, but its submission. There were no fireworks in Bogotá, no dancing in the plazas. Only silence. The kind of silence that falls before a storm. The kind that comes when a country seals a pact with the devil. The inauguration of President Pablo Escobar was an event of chilling theatricality, a carefully orchestrated display of power that signaled the dawn of a new, terrifying era for Colombia. The ceremony was held not in the traditional grandeur of the Capitolio Nacional, but in an open-air stadium in Medellin, the heart of his empire. The audience was not the usual collection of foreign dignitaries and political elites, but a massive, roaring crowd of his most fervent supporters, trucked in from the comunas he had built. Flanked by generals whose loyalty he had purchased, and surrounded by a private army that dwarfed the official presidential guard, Escobar took the oath of office. His inaugural address, broadcast to a stunned nation and a horrified world, was devoid of democratic platitudes. It was a blunt, uncompromising statement of intent. "Time for talking is over," he declared, his voice echoing across the stadium. "The time for weakness has passed. For decades you have been lied to by the same corrupt families who have bled this nation dry. They gave you war, I give you peace. They gave you poverty, I give you prosperity. There will be order, there will be security. For those who love Colombia, there will be everything. For the traitors, the criminals, and those who stand in the way of progress, there will be nothing but justice, the justice of Plomo." The first 100 days of the Escobar administration moved with the brutal efficiency of a cartel operation. There was no legislative gridlock, no delicate political negotiation. Policy was dictated from the Casa de Nariño, the presidential palace, which was now more fortress than government be. Yielding and implemented by a strange and fearsome hybrid of state and criminal power. Escobar's first and most dramatic move was the declaration of a national peace accord. This was not a negotiation, it was a series of ultimatums. He called a summit, not with political opponents, but with the leaders of the rival Cali cartel, the remaining guerrilla factions, and the major paramilitary groups. The terms were simple: cease all hostilities, dismantle your independent military structures, and integrate into the new national economic framework. In exchange for their surrender, they would receive a full amnesty for past crimes and a share in the new, state-controlled enterprises. Those who refused the offer would be declared enemies of the peace and hunted down without mercy. The Cali cartel, ever the pragmatists, were the first to acquiesce. They understood that an open war with a man who now controlled the state military, in addition to his own personal army, was unwinnable. They agreed to a junior partnership in Escobar's new vision, ceding control of their smuggling routes in exchange for a guaranteed slice of the profits and a role in the legitimate businesses that would be used to launder the nation's wealth. The guerrilla groups were a harder nut to crack. Some of the more ideological commanders of the FARC and ELN rejected the deal outright, denouncing Escobar as a narco-fascist. The response was swift and merciless. Joint operations, combining elite units of the Colombian army with Escobar's own veteran sicarios, descended on their jungle encampments. The war on the guerrillas, which the state had waged ineffectually for decades, was now prosecuted with a terrifying new ferocity and an intimate knowledge of the insurgents' tactics and hiding places, often provided by former traffickers who knew the jungle routes. The message was clear: there was no room for armed opposition of any kind in Escobar's Colombia. Simultaneously, Escobar moved to formalize his control over the nation's primary source of wealth. He announced the creation of the Corporación Nacional de la Coca, the National Coca Corporation. In a stroke, the cocaine industry was nationalized. The CNC would control everything from the price paid to coca farmers to the processing of the paste and the export of the final product. Escobar argued, in a televised address that blended economic theory with gangster logic, that this was the only way to end the violence and chaos associated with the trade. "For too long, this resource has enriched only a few, while bringing death and destruction to our streets," he said, standing before a chart showing projected national revenues. "By controlling it, we turn this poison into medicine for the nation's economy. The profits will no longer fund private armies and terror. They will fund our schools, our hospitals, our future. We will sell to the world, yes, but on our terms as a sovereign nation. The Americans want to lecture us about supply. Let them deal with their own demand. My responsibility is to the people of Colombia, not to the addicts of Miami." This move was, in essence, the creation of the world's first true narco-state, not as a shadow entity operating within a legitimate government, but as the explicit, central pillar of the national economy. To ensure the legal and judicial framework supported this new reality, Escobar initiated a complete overhaul of the country's law enforcement and judiciary. The old Supreme Court, whose members had been terrorized for years, was effectively dissolved. Escobar created a new High Court of National Security, appointing judges whose loyalty was primarily to him. He announced a judicial emergency, purging hundreds of judges, prosecutors, and investigators who were deemed corrupt or, more accurately, uncooperative. They were replaced by a new generation of legal professionals who understood the new rules of the game. The police and military underwent a similar transformation. Key commands were handed to officers who had long been on his payroll. The search bloc, the elite police unit that had been his most determined foe, was disbanded, its members either dismissed or reassigned to remote border posts. In its place, Escobar created a new Special Forces unit, the Fuerzas Especiales de Pacificación, the Special Pacification Forces, an organization that blended the discipline of the military with the ruthlessness of his former sicarios. Its mandate was simple: to enforce the president's will swiftly and without question. The domestic response to these first 100 days was a deeply polarized mix of terrified hope and silent despair. In the poorer barrios, there was genuine celebration. The promised silver began to flow. Massive public works projects, funded by the first official profits from the CNC, broke ground. Food prices stabilized as Escobar's enforcers cracked down on price gouging. For the first time in a generation, the streets of Medellin and even RTS of Bogotá felt safe to walk at night, albeit under the watchful eyes of heavily armed patrols. A fictional quote from a Medellin shopkeeper might have been, "Is this man a saint? No. Do I know where the money comes from? I'm not a fool, but my children can play outside without fear of a stray bullet. My shipments arrive on time without being taxed by 3 different armed groups. He promised peace and he has delivered. It is a hard peace, a quiet peace, but it is peace." For the middle class, the intellectuals, the journalists, and the remnants of the old political establishment, however, these 100 days were a nightmare. The initial quiet was understood not as peace, but as the silence of the tomb. The press, once one of the most vibrant and courageous in Latin America, was neutered. Editors and journalists who had bravely defied Escobar in the past now faced a stark choice: self-censorship or disappearance. Prominent newspapers began to parrot the government's line, praising the new era of national restoration. Opposition figures went underground, fled the country, or simply fell silent, their fear a palpable, suffocating presence in the nation's political life. Hope had been replaced by a grim, pragmatic fear. The question was no longer how to fight Escobar, but how to survive him. The first 100 days had ended the chaos, but in its place, they had erected the scaffolding of a totalitarian state, built on a foundation of cocaine and fear. The ascendancy of Pablo Escobar to the presidency of Colombia did not merely send shockwaves across the globe, it triggered a geopolitical earthquake. The established post-Cold War order, predicated on the promotion of democracy and the global war on drugs, was confronted with an unprecedented and deeply destabilizing reality. A sovereign nation, a member of the United Nations, had not just been captured by a criminal syndicate, it had become one. The international fallout was swift, severe, and multifaceted, transforming Colombia into a pariah state and the epicenter of a new global crisis. The reaction from the United States was one of pure, unadulterated fury. For the administration of President George H.W. Bush, which had invested immense political capital and resources into combating the flow of cocaine, Escobar's presidency was a direct and humiliating blow. It represented the catastrophic failure of a decade of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The immediate response was a flurry of punitive measures. Washington refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Escobar government. Full diplomatic relations were severed, and the Colombian ambassador was expelled. A raft of crippling economic sanctions were imposed, freezing all Colombian government assets in U.S. banks and prohibiting American businesses from any and all transactions with the new Colombian regime. The U.S. also led a successful effort to have Colombia suspended from the Organization of American States, OAS, citing the complete collapse of democratic order. Let there be no mistake, a fictionalized President Bush would declare in a televised address from the Oval Office. We are witnessing the birth of a gangster state on our doorstep. A man who has murdered judges, journalists, and innocent civilians, a man who has poisoned our cities and our children, now sits in a presidential palace. This is not a government, it is a criminal enterprise masquerading as one. We will not stand for it. We will isolate it, we will suffocate it, and we will bring its leaders to justice. Behind the public condemnation, a shadow war was already in motion. The CIA's Langley headquarters became the nerve center for operations aimed at destabilizing and ultimately overthrowing the Escobar regime. Funding was secretly funneled to exiled Colombian politicians, journalists, and military officers who had fled the country. The agency began actively recruiting assets within Escobar's inner circle, hoping to foment a coup or an internal power struggle. U.S. intelligence intensified its support for Los Peps, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, a real-world vigilante group which in this timeline re-emerges with a vengeance, now unofficially backed by American covert aid. Their campaign of assassinating Escobar's lieutenants and bombing his properties would be portrayed as an indigenous resistance movement, but its logistics and intelligence would bear the fingerprints of the CIA. The Pentagon, meanwhile, drew up contingency plans for direct military intervention. The U.S. Southern Command, based in Panama, was put on high alert. Naval assets were redeployed to the Caribbean, ostensibly for counter-narcotics exercises, but forming a clear blockade around Colombia's coastline. The possibility of targeted airstrikes against the headquarters of the National Coca Corporation, CNC, or even the presidential palace itself was seriously debated in the White House Situation Room. The primary deterrent to such a move, as the risk of a full-scale war and the potential for massive civilian casualties, which would be a public relations disaster and could destabilize the entire region. Colombia's immediate neighbors reacted with a mixture of fear and opportunistic caution. Venezuela and Ecuador, sharing long and porous borders with Colombia, were terrified of the conflict spilling over. They beefed up their military presence along their frontiers and struggled to cope with a new wave of refugees, not the poor and displaced, but the wealthy and the political opposition fleeing Escobar's regime. Panama, still recovering from the U.S. invasion that had ousted Manuel Noriega, found itself in a particularly precarious position. Escobar, seeking to bypass the American naval blockade, began to utilize Panamanian ports and financial institutions for his new state-run smuggling operations, putting the Panamanian government under immense pressure from both Washington and Bogotá. A fictional news report from the era might read. Panama City, caught between a rock and a hard place, the Panamanian government is struggling to navigate the diplomatic minefield created by the Escobar regime in neighboring Colombia. U.S. officials have issued a stern warning that any cooperation with Bogotá's National Coca Corporation will result in Panama being labeled a state sponsor of narco-terrorism. Meanwhile, sources within the Panamanian security forces report a significant increase in the presence of armed commercial attachés from Colombia, putting immense pressure on local officials to look the other way. Further afield, the impact was also profound. In Europe, governments followed the U.S. lead in imposing sanctions and condemning the regime, but some were more hesitant. For countries with a more pragmatic, trade-focused foreign policy, the idea of a stable, albeit criminal, Colombia that could guarantee the supply of other commodities like coffee and oil was a complex issue. The global drug trade was utterly transformed. With the creation of the CNC, Escobar attempted to do what no criminal had ever done before: launder not just money, but an entire national economy. He sought to use the immense profits from the state-controlled cocaine trade to launch massive, legitimate national initiatives. He approached international construction firms from Europe and Asia, offering them lucrative, tax-free contracts to build the infrastructure projects he had promised, all to be paid for from the national treasury, which was now indistinguishable from the cartel's coffers. He announced the creation of a Colombian sovereign wealth fund, which would invest narco profits in global markets, attempting to insinuate his state's illicit wealth into the legitimate international financial system. He even made a shocking proposal at a specially convened and widely boycotted press conference. He offered to partner with international pharmaceutical companies to research the medicinal properties of the coca leaf, a brazen attempt to rebrand his product and gain a veneer of scientific legitimacy. This created a global game of whack-a-mole for financial regulators. Escobar's government employed an army of the world's most sophisticated accountants and lawyers to find loopholes in the international banking system, setting up shell corporations and using third countries to move the nation's drug money. The impact on the streets of America and Europe was immediate. With the official backing of the Colombian state, the supply of cocaine became more reliable and cheaper than ever before. The purity of the drug on the street increased, leading to a new public health crisis. The DEA and other international law enforcement agencies found themselves in a bizarre new reality. Their primary target was no longer a clandestine organization to be hunted in the shadows, but a sovereign government that operated in the open. The war on drugs had escalated from a police action into a full-blown international conflict, with President Pablo Escobar, the CEO of Colombia Inc., standing at its defiant, blood-soaked center. Once the initial shock of his seizure of power had settled into a grim new reality, the true nature of President Escobar's vision for Colombia began to take shape. It was a grandiose, terrifying, and deeply contradictory project, a populist paradise built on the foundations of a totalitarian narco-state. It was a vision of national pride and prosperity, delivered through the barrel of a gun and financed by the world's addiction. Escobar saw himself not as a mere dictator, but as a revolutionary, a founding father for a new Colombia, and he used every tool at his disposal, from concrete to propaganda, to mold the nation in his image. The centerpiece of his domestic policy was a massive expansion of the social programs he had pioneered as a Paisa Robin Hood. With the full, centralized power of the state and the limitless coffers of the National Coca Corporation, C at his command, he launched projects on a scale that dwarfed his earlier efforts. The Medellin Sin Tugurios, Medellin Without Slums program was rolled out nationwide. Entire shantytowns were razed, and in their place rose massive, utilitarian housing blocks, providing hundreds of thousands of people with clean water, electricity, and solid roofs over their heads for the first time. Each new building was inaugurated with great fanfare, and each was adorned with a bronze plaque, a gift to the people from your president, Pablo Escobar. He launched a national literacy crusade, sending brigades of young, paid educators into the countryside to teach peasants to read and write, using textbooks that lionized the president and explained the economic miracle of the national restoration. New schools and clinics were built in remote villages that had never seen a government official. A national food subsidy program was established, distributing basic goods at heavily discounted prices through a network of state-run stores, a system that also served as a mechanism for social control, as access to the subsidies could be denied to anyone suspected of disloyalty. This was the silver part of his silver or lead philosophy, and for a significant segment of the population, it was intoxicating. Escobar was delivering on his promises in a tangible way that no democratic government ever had. He was providing the basic necessities that the state had long neglected, and in doing so, he was forging a powerful bond of dependency and gratitude with the poor. This populist agenda was amplified by a pervasive and sophisticated propaganda machine. Escobar understood the power of the media to shape reality. Having seized or intimidated the mainstream press into submission, he created a state media apparatus that was a monument to his ego. The national television network was rebranded Telerastauración, and its nightly news broadcast, The President's Word, became mandatory viewing. The program was a slickly produced hour of hagiography, showcasing the president's latest achievements, inaugurating a new hospital, personally handing out land titles to grateful farmers, or overseeing a successful military operation against enemies of the peace. A fictional excerpt from The President's Word broadcast. Anchor, good evening, Colombia. Today was another historic day for the national restoration. In the Department of Caquetá, President Escobar personally delivered the keys to 500 new homes in the New Dawn housing project. As you can see from these images, the joy of the people was overwhelming, a testament to a leader who feels the needs of his people in his heart. Later, the president met with military commanders to review the continuing success of the pacification program, which has brought a level of security to our countryside not seen in a generation. A new day is truly dawning for our beloved nation, thanks to the vision and strength of one man. This cult of personality was everywhere. His face, rendered in a heroic, determined style, stared down from billboards and murals. Schools were renamed in his honor. Children were taught songs praising his wisdom and generosity. He was creating a new national narrative, with himself as the central hero who had rescued Colombia from the abyss. Behind this facade of populist benevolence, however, lay the iron fist of a totalitarian state. The lead part of his governing philosophy was applied with ruthless efficiency to any hint of opposition. Democracy, as it had been known, was systematically dismantled. The Congress was not officially dissolved, but it was rendered completely impotent. It became a rubber-stamped body, filled with loyalists from the movement for national restoration, whose only job was to unanimously approve the president's decrees. The suppression of dissent was absolute. The new intelligence agency, which was a fusion of the old state security apparatus and Escobar's own cartel intelligence network, had eyes and ears everywhere. Neighborhood watch committees, ostensibly created to improve public safety, were in reality networks of informants, reporting on any counter-revolutionary talk or activity. University campuses, traditional hotbeds of dissent, were placed under heavy surveillance, with undercover agents enrolling in classes to monitor professors and students. There were no more opposition rallies, no critical newspaper articles, no satirical cartoons. Those who dared to speak out simply vanished. They were picked up in the middle of the night by unmarked cars, their families told they were being held for questioning in the interest of national security. Most were never seen again. The dreaded practice of the false positive, where civilians were killed and dressed in guerrilla uniforms, was perfected and industrialized, used to eliminate any potential threat, from student leaders to troublesome union organizers. This new narco-state modeled W as a unique and terrifying form of governance. On the surface, it had the trapping of a modern nation-state, a president, a cabinet, a military, a bureaucracy, but its core logic was that of a criminal organization. The primary goal of the state was not the welfare of its citizens in a democratic sense, but the maximization of profit and the consolidation of the chief executive's power. The national budget was a fiction. The real economy was driven by the CNC. Government ministries were less about public service and more about managing different aspects of the global cocaine enterprise. The Ministry of Agriculture was tasked with increasing coca yields. The Ministry of Transport was responsible for ensuring the product moved efficiently to the export points. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was essentially a high-level money laundering and international negotiation department, tasked with finding new markets and new ways to circumvent sanctions. Society was restructured along these lines. Loyalty was prized above all else. Those who demonstrated their unwavering support for the president and his vision were rewarded with jobs, housing, and opportunities. Those who did not were cast out, stripped of their rights, and targeted as enemies of the state. It was a society held together by a fragile, volatile mixture of genuine gratitude from the beneficiaries of Escobar's largesse and a deep, pervasive fear among everyone else. In his vision, Colombia would be strong, proud, and independent. It would be a nation that thumbed its nose at the United States, a country that had harnessed its most notorious export and turned it into the engine of its own rebirth. It would be a nation of order where the trains ran on time and the streets were safe because everyone understood the price of disobedience. It was a vision of a gilded cage, a prosperous prison. It was Pablo Escobar's Colombia, and for its captive citizens there was no escape. For a time, the brutal stability of the Escobar regime seemed unshakable. The silence of the opposition, the fawning praise of the state-controlled media, and the tangible benefits of the narco-funded social programs created an illusion of a nation remade, a population pacified. But the foundations of this new Colombia were built on fear and cocaine, and such foundations are inherently unstable. The very methods Escobar used to seize and maintain power contained the seeds of his eventual decline. The resistance, when it came, was not a single, coordinated uprising, but a slow, creeping decay from within and a desperate, bloody struggle from without. The first cracks in the monolithic facade of control appeared where they so often do, among the youth. The university students who had been silenced by fear began to find new, clandestine ways to resist. They could no longer organize open protests, but they could engage in a quiet, symbolic warfare. Anti-Escobar graffiti would appear overnight on the walls of government buildings, crude caricatures of El Presidente with a skull for a face. Secret pamphlets, crudely printed in hidden basements, would circulate, detailing the stories of the disappeared and mocking the official propaganda of Telerestauración. These were small acts, easily erased or dismissed by the state, but they were significant. They were proof that not everyone had been bought or broken. These acts of defiance began to escalate. Student groups, using encrypted messaging, a primitive form in this timeline, perhaps using coded language on early internet bulletin boards accessed via university computers, started organizing flash protests. A crowd would suddenly materialize in a public square, chant anti-government slogans for a few minutes, and then melt away before the security forces could respond en masse. While many were arrested in the aftermath, the message was sent. The spirit of resistance was alive. The media, though cowed, was not entirely dead. Exiled Colombian journalists operating from Miami, Caracas, or Madrid established pirate radio stations and websites. La Voz de la Colombia Libre, the voice of a free Colombia, would broadcast into the country, its signal often jammed but sometimes breaking through, offering an alternative to the state's saccharine narrative. They would read the names of the disappeared, interview defectors from the regime, and provide evidence of the corruption that festered beneath the surface of the national restoration. These broadcasts became forbidden knowledge, whispered about and shared on secretly duplicated cassette tapes. Simultaneously, the alliances that had brought Escobar to power began to fray. The National Peace Accord was, in reality, a shotgun marriage, and the honeymoon was short-lived. The leaders of the former Cali cartel, now junior partners in the National Coca Corporation, CNC, chafed under Escobar's authority. They had been kings in their own right, and they resented their new role as glorified DLE managers. They saw Escobar's increasingly erratic behavior and his high-profile defiance of the United States as bad for business. They began to quietly re-establish their old independent networks, siphoning off product from the CNC and selling it through their own channels, a direct challenge to the state's monopoly. This internal betrayal was mirrored within the government itself. Escobar had built his empire on loyalty, but it was a loyalty purchased with money and maintained through fear. As his paranoia grew, that fear began to curdle into resentment. He saw enemies everywhere. He would purge high-ranking military officers, cabinet ministers, and even old associates from his Medellin days on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. These purges created a vicious cycle. The more he eliminated perceived threats, the more he alienated those who remained, creating a climate where no one felt safe. A fictionalized internal memo from a CIA analyst might have noted. Subject: regime instability in Colombia. Escobar's leadership style is transitioning from calculated ruthlessness to outright paranoia. His circle of trusted advisors is shrinking daily. He is increasingly isolated, relying on a handful of family members and young, fanatically loyal sicarios. This presents a strategic opportunity. The old guard within the military and the former Cali leadership feel increasingly marginalized and threatened. They are becoming prime targets for recruitment. A well-placed rumor, a manufactured piece of evidence suggesting they are next on the purge list, could be the catalyst that pushes them to act against him. This internal decay was matched by an intensification of the external conflict. The Los Peps movement, secretly fueled by CIA funds and intelligence from the disgruntled Cali cartel, escalated its campaign. Their attacks became more brazen. They were no longer just targeting Escobar's property. They were systematically hunting his family, his financial masterminds, and his most trusted enforcers. This campaign of narco-terrorism against narco-terrorism brought the war to a deeply personal level for Escobar, puncturing his aura of invincibility. Escobar's own mental state began to visibly decline. The immense pressure of running a country, fighting a multi-front war, and constantly watching for traitors took its toll. His public appearances became less frequent. When he did appear on the president's word, he often seemed bloated, tired, and prone to rambling, paranoid tirades against his enemies, both real and imagined. He vacillated wildly between grandiose pronouncements about Colombia's glorious future and vicious threats against the traitors and American puppets he saw everywhere. The conflict between his initial twisted idealism and the brutal reality of his totalitarian rule became starkly apparent. He had promised to build a paradise, but to do so, he had turned Colombia into a prison. He had promised to end the violence, but he had merely monopolized it. The social programs continued, but they became more about control than charity. Access to housing or food subsidies was now explicitly tied to participation in pro-regime rallies and informing on one's neighbors. The initial gratitude of the poor began to be replaced by a weary sense of obligation. The military, the very institution he had co-opted to secure his power, was becoming a breeding ground for conspiracy. The constitutionalist faction officers who had been sidelined but not purged, who still believed in a democratic Colombia, began to secretly organize. They saw the nation being destroyed from within, its international reputation ruined, and its sovereignty sold for a mountain of cocaine. They started making clandestine contact with the exiled politicians and, through them, with their American backers. The plot for a coup d'etat was no longer a theoretical option. It was being actively planned in safe houses in Bogotá and at secret meetings in the borderlands. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a steady, grinding erosion. The peace Escobar had imposed was revealed to be a fragile, temporary truce. The prosperity he had promised was a poisoned chalice. The man who had presented himself as Colombia's savior was now its chief jailer, a paranoid king sitting on a throne of skulls, watching his narco-utopia crumble around him. The stage was set for the final, bloody act. The end of President Pablo Escobar's reign was as violent and chaotic as his rise. The final chapter was not a simple assassination or a clean coup, but a nationwide convulsion, a perfect storm of all the forces he had sought to suppress and control. The spark that ignited the final conflagration came from within his own fortress. The coup, codenamed Operation Liberator, was a coordinated effort between the constitutionalist faction of the military, the vengeful Cali cartel leadership, and the CIA. It began with the surgical elimination of Escobar's knee. Our circle of security by Los Peps, who had been provided with detailed intelligence on their locations and routines. Simultaneously, loyalist army units, commanded by a general who had been secretly planning the coup for months, stormed the presidential palace. But Escobar was not one to be taken easily. The Casa de Nariño had been transformed into a veritable fortress. The ensuing battle was not a swift takeover, but a brutal block-by-block siege that raged for 2 days, turning the heart of Bogotá into a war zone. The Special Pacification Forces, Escobar's fanatically loyal Praetorian Guard, fought with ferocious desperation against the regular army. In the end, cornered in his bunker beneath the palace, with the sounds of battle closing in, the reign of Pablo Escobar concluded. Accounts of his final moments would forever be shrouded in myth and propaganda. The official story released by the new provisional government was that he died in the final assault, fighting to the last. Other rumors, whispered for decades to come, would claim he took his own life, or that he was captured and summarily executed by the Cali godfathers to ensure his silence. Regardless of the specifics, the king of cocaine was dead. The news of his demise was met not with universal joy, but with a complex and fractured national reaction. In the wealthy districts of Bogotá, people cautiously emerged to celebrate. In the comunas of Medellin, there was genuine grief and rioting, a final, desperate cry of loyalty to the man they still saw as their benefactor. The immediate aftermath was a power vacuum of terrifying proportions. The provisional government, a shaky coalition of old guard politicians, military leaders, and figures who had been in exile, struggled to assert control. The national peace accord shattered instantly. The Cali cartel, having helped topple their great rival, moved to seize control of the Narco-State apparatus Escobar had created. The guerrilla factions, seeing the state in chaos, relaunched their insurgencies with renewed vigor. The paramilitary groups, which had been nominally integrated into the state, reasserted their autonomy, leading to a brutal, multi-sided civil war for control of the lucrative coca-growing territories and smuggling routes. The Colombia that emerged from the shadow of Escobar's rule was a nation profoundly scarred, its institutions hollowed out, its social fabric torn to shreds. The political class, which had been either complicit or terrorized into silence, lacked any real moral authority. The judiciary and police were deeply corrupted, infested with individuals who had been loyal to the old regime. The military was fractured, with lingering suspicions between the constitutionalists who led the coup and those who had served Escobar. The United States and the international community, having supported the coup, now faced the monumental task of helping to rebuild a nation that had been fundamentally broken. A massive international aid package was put together, aimed at restoring democratic institutions, reforming the justice system, and combating the resurgent cartels. But the damage was too deep to be easily repaired. The war on drugs had to be completely rethought. The experience of a narco-state had shown the profound limitations of a purely supply-side strategy. The debate shifted, with more emphasis being placed on demand reduction, alternative development for coca-growing regions, and a more nuanced understanding of the deep socioeconomic roots of the drug trade. In the long term, the legacy of Escobar's presidency in this alternate history is a dark and cautionary tale that would haunt Latin America for generations. The idea of a successful narco-state, even one that ultimately collapsed, had been planted. In other fragile nations plagued by corruption and weak governance, radical populists would emerge, citing the Escobar model of trading democratic freedoms for narco-funded security and social programs. His regime became a case study in how criminal enterprises could exploit the language of populism and national restoration to achieve state capture. U.S. foreign policy in the region was permanently altered. The simplistic black-and-white approach of the Cold War and the early war on drugs gave way to a more complex, and often more interventionist, strategy focused on nation-building, institutional reform, and combating corruption, recognizing that a failed state was the most fertile ground for the next Escobar to take root. The historical legacy of this fictional Pablo Escobar would be fiercely debated. For the rest of the world and for the Colombian elites, he was an unambiguous monster, a narco-terrorist who hijacked a nation and turned it into his personal fiefdom. He was a symbol of the ultimate corruption of power. But for a segment of the Colombian population, particularly the urban poor who had received their first taste of state support from his bloody and yes, the memory would be more complex, more tragic. They would remember the homes, the schools, the fleeting sense of security and dignity he provided. They would see him as a deeply flawed, even evil figure, but one who, unlike the traditional elites, had at least seen them. He would become a dark folk saint, a tragic anti-hero whose story was a testament to the state's historic failure to care for its own people. A fictional historian, writing 50 years later, might conclude, "To understand the phenomenon of President Escobar, one must understand the despair that created him. He was not a cause, but a symptom, a monstrous symptom of a nation's deep-seated illnesses, inequality, corruption, and violence." His brief, brutal reign stands as a permanent warning. When democracy fails to deliver on its most basic promises of security and dignity for all its citizens, the people will eventually, out of desperation, turn to the devil who promises them the world, never realizing until it is too late that the price is their very soul. The Colombia of this alternate future would eventually find its way back to a form of democracy, but it would be a fragile, cynical, and permanently scarred version of its former self. The ghost of President Escobar, the man who offered peace for the price of freedom, would never be fully exorcised. His story would become a permanent part of the national psyche, a dark mirror reflecting the complex, often tragic, choices a nation can make when it is pushed to the very brink of collapse.